Dear class president, dear colleagues, dear guests, dear friends from the ACDH, welcome on behalf of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities. We're going to have a very interesting lecture today. Before we start, before we get down to brass tacks, I'd like to say a few words on the institution which is organizing this series of lectures. You're a guest today of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities, which was set up with the declared goal of fostering digital methods in the various fields of the humanities. The center is active in a number of areas. We support our fellow researchers by working on digital infrastructures, developing technical services, hosting and publishing digital data, developing software and working on ways of efficient knowledge transfer from our narrow community to the humanities research community at large by offering advice and guidance in a wide range of digital humanities matters. Apart from providing infrastructure services, the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities also pursues research in various fields of the digital humanities. In the past couple of months, our institute is very new. We have been founded just about a year ago. Our team has been focusing in their research on non-standard and historical linguistic varieties, digital archaeology, ancient history, and e-lexicography. Current projects investigate innovative technical infrastructure components, digital standards, digital language resources, and semantic technologies. All of these activities have been embedded in the European Infrastructure Consortia, Clarin Eric and Daria Eric, and over the past few years, the colleagues have been actively participating in these initiatives by developing core infrastructure components and by contributing to a number of important working groups and task forces in these institutions. What all of this is about is digital humanities, which we regard as part of a profound social transformation. Digital humanities imply new methods, new questions, and hopefully new answers. The humanities have got to do with technology, but not only with technology. Our much wider understanding of technology-enhanced research in social sciences, cultural studies, and humanities has got to do with innovation and has a strong social component. For us, digital humanities means combining digital and social infrastructures, means inter- and, that's particularly important, transdisciplinary approaches. We strongly believe that what we are doing in the digital realm goes way beyond academia. Through applying digital methods, the borders between academia and the society have, to our mind, become much more permeable. For us, collaborative settings are an essential part of what digital humanities is about. This also implies participative technologies. And last but not least, the whole range of open things such as open science, open data, open access, and open source. And again, very important for us here when we talk about open access, we do not only mean research results, papers, monographies, and such things, but also research data. The ACDH has been founded with the express goal of fostering and furthering the cause of the humanities. As such, we also have, to a certain degree, and in view of a lack elsewhere, an educational mission to disseminate the new methods of our community of practice and to support digitally working researchers in their endeavors. To this end, we started early last year two new types of information roadshows here at the Academy. The first format we called the ACDH Lectures. The second format is the so-called ACDH Tool Gallery. The idea behind this type of event has grown out of a great need in practical skills to use new and innovative tools and services, and an unfortunate institutional lack of opportunities to acquire such skills in our nearer environment. Our new series of workshops combines morning lectures given by proven experts in the field with hands-on practical sessions in the afternoon, in which participants are given the opportunity to interact with the tools and methods to do something practical themselves. This is a list of lectures we did last year, all very important, outstanding international scholars, capable of, and that was particularly important for us, capable of inspiring the next generation of researchers and convincing them of the usefulness, validity, and innovative strength of our approaches and tools. If you want to know more about all of these things, check it out, please, on our website. We also have Digital Humanities mailing lists in Austria, to which you can subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And last but not least, don't hesitate to get directly in touch with me or any of our colleagues. 2 minutes ago, I stated that Digital Humanities is very much about cooperating and not doing things alone, and therefore we always try in our lectures to find cooperation partners also from other institutions, which in the case of our event today is a project funded by the Austrian Science Fund, which goes by the name Benedictines, Church Reform and the State in Austria, and the Institute of History Studies of the University of Vienna. And I now ask our colleague, Thomas Walnig, to introduce our guest of today.
Thank you very much. I might add that I'm among the low-key researchers that are being helped along with digital issues by the ACDH team in a very fruitful manner, and we would not be able to do many of the things that we are actually doing without the kind support of Karl-Heinz Mürz, Daniel Schopper, and others. Having said this, I'm extremely pleased to be able to welcome Keith Michael Baker. I'm glad he accepted the invitation to come to Vienna. I'm glad that it was possible that the ACDH invited him here in the series of the lectures. We are just coming from the University of Vienna, where we had a workshop this afternoon, so this is kind of more public, more perhaps synthetic part in a discussion that has been going on all afternoon. And I have now the pleasure to tell you a few words about Professor Baker, who is now in Paris, but usually in Stanford, California. When preparing for this introduction, realizing that he's one of the leading experts on the history of the French Revolution and of the Enlightenment at large, I also realized that the traditional trope of not having to introduce somebody because presumably he or she is known to everybody acquires a different meaning in the digital humanities context, in the sense that we should introduce ourselves to each other because we come from thoroughly different backgrounds, and sometimes it helps to understand the pathways and the intellectual background people come from when they meet in this shared space and shared discussion ground of digital humanities. Professor Baker earned his first academic degrees in England, at Cambridge, at University College of London, at University of London, before starting his academic career in the United States, where he had two long and important appointments at the University of Chicago from 1977 to 89, at the Department of History and the College in the Morris Fishbein Center for the Study of the History of Science and Medicine, and in the Committee of the Conceptual Foundations of Science. I'm saying this deliberately to point to a context of history of science, history of ideas, history of thought. He did visiting stays at Yale, at UCLA, and also 4 times through the 80s and 90s at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. From 1988 to the present, Professor Baker has been J.E. Wallace Sterling Professor in the Humanities and Professor at the Department of History, and by courtesy at the departments of French and Italian. And among the things that I asked him to elaborate on this evening is exactly the institutional setting at Stanford, beyond history department, French and Italian department, of course, the so-called CESTA that you will hear more about in a minute, the Center for Textual and Spatial Analysis, which is a kind of digital humanities hub that he and many of his colleagues are engaging with. Right now, he is in Paris at the Institut d'études avancées, and he's writing a book on Marat as prophet of terror. Among his many grants and awards, I would like to point to a few. He is Chevalier dans l'Ordre de Palme Académique. He is elected member of the American Philosophical Society. And 2 years ago, he won the award for scholarly distinction, which is a lifetime achievement award from the American Historical Association. And I would also like to mention a context quite some colleagues in Austria might know him from, which is the International Society for 18th Century Studies, which he chaired as a president for some years. Trying to characterize his academic work in the invitation and the biographical three-liner that we sent out, he pointed to the main books he's known for as Condorcet, From National Philosophy to Social Mathematics in 1975, and Inventing the French Revolution, Essays on French Political Culture in the 18th Century, first from 1975, second from 1990, as well as to a book that I will now pass around because it's also in a way at the center of what we will discuss later. Scripting Revolution is a book he co-edited with Dan Edelstein at Stanford, and it's about the comparative study of revolutions from, if you will, the Glorious Revolution to the events happening in the Arab world in 2011, and based on a notion of script. So the idea that, especially from the French Revolution onwards, there was a script, a imagined sequence of events for revolutions that basically was at the disposal of revolutionaries who would frame themselves as such. I'm saying this to point you to the intellectual background that Keith Baker comes from. So the study of political action as something displayed in language and intimately linked to the use of language. Basically, when a revolutionary says to be a revolutionary, he evokes a set of symbols, linguistic practices, actions that are in the shared imaginary imagination, and he basically builds his political action upon that. This is to point to a kind of linguistic awareness of political culture that goes through his entire oeuvre, and that, this is my point here, brings him to digital humanities projects that engage with linguistic analysis of corpora. What he did in one of the chapters of this book is look for the terms revolution and co-occurrences with that term in early English books online, in the Encyclopédie Thesaurus, and in other larger databases at disposal here. So without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Baker to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming and for being prepared, especially to listen to me in English. It's a great privilege to be allowed to speak in one's own language, and I do appreciate that. Thank you, Thomas, for your very generous introduction. I think some modesty is in order here. I want to say, just to underline, that I know very little about computer science. I'm far from being a specialist in the digital humanities, but as you will have gathered from the introduction, I'm a historian of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution, but above all, I'm interested in politics, political thought, and political culture. And the way I think about this is that politics is, above all, about the definition of the situation, which is to say, it's about making claims about what the nature of the present situation is, how it can be thought about, what claims actors in the present situation can indeed make. So it's about articulating, upholding, enforcing, manipulating, improvising claims on the basis of the possibilities that are available in the repertory of the political culture in the particular place and time that one is thinking about, which is to say that it is above all about language. So I have been, in my career, principally interested in the way in which one can study language as a way of constituting the possibility of action in particular situations. And for obvious reasons then, I've been very interested in the digitalization, and the possibilities of digitalization for the study of political languages and their transformation. And I've been involved basically in two digital humanities projects, which I like to just mention, in pursuit of that kind of approach. The first one being the Artful Project at the University of Chicago. The Artful Project was started in 1982, and I was lucky enough to be one of the people helping to start that. It took a database of French language texts that had been prepared had been digitized in preparation for a dictionary of the French language, and it began to ask what could be done with this body of digitized texts as a basis for scholarly analysis. Over the years, this project, the Artful Project, has grown enormously. the body of text, the database has been expanded, though it will never be expanded adequately. Historians are very greedy. They always want more data, and that is true of every database, I think, that one will ever encounter. But it's also been developed in very powerful ways in terms of its search engine called Philologic, which allows very ambitious and sophisticated forms of data analysis. And I'll just mention here in that context an article by the director of the Artful Project, Robert Morrissey, and some colleagues that will be coming out fairly soon in the Revue d'Histoire littéraire de la France. It's about the evolution of the Artful database, and it really outlines three ways in which data analysis has been developed at Chicago. First, concordances, collocations, lexical fields, the establishment of those on the basis of the data set, which is something that has been of particular interest to me. Second, data mining, machine learning, which has become a very interesting possibility. For example, one of the things that the Artful Project did was to digitize the entire Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert. That makes for some very interesting possibilities, one of which, for example, is that one can ask the Philologic to compare Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, Esprit des Lois, with the text of the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, and find, and this is essentially using plagiarization software, one can find, in fact, all of the places in the Encyclopédie in which the work of Montesquieu, the Esprit des Lois, was cannibalized. And it's enormous, and it turns out that Montesquieu is really one of the uncited authors of many articles in the Encyclopédie. This is something that we would never have known had we not been able to run this kind of analysis. And then finally, the sequence analysis, sequence alignment is another way of approaching the database and discovering characteristics, for example, of the encyclopedia. One other thing I'll say about the Encyclopédie is that the encyclopedia had a form of classification. Each article was supposed to define the term, but assign the term to a certain topic within a classification of knowledge. It turns out that a very substantial fraction of the articles do not have a classification. One of the things that Philologic can do, this search engine can do, is in fact do an analysis of the unclassified articles and assign classification to them. And that really fills out our understanding of the Encyclopédie in a very specific way. So let me just say a little bit about the work that I did while I was at the University of Chicago with the Artful Project. And I'm going to show you this. I was very interested, as Thomas Founding mentioned, in the term revolution. And when I started this research, I was very excited because we had Artful, and lo and behold, we were able to look at occurrences of the term revolution in the database. And this is a table that I produced for work that I did in 1982. This now is utterly commonplace. Google can do this much better than we could in 1982. But it's where we started in terms of thinking about the term revolution and what it might mean. For the volume Scripting Revolution that Thomas Valnick mentioned, I redid the analysis of the term revolution on the basis of the current possibilities. So I used 3 databases: the ECHO English 18th Century Collections Online, which is a database of English works published in the 18th century. I used the Artful database, which is the most expansive database of French works. And then I also used a database of early American publications, just to see the use of the term revolution in each of those 3 contexts. And this is what I came up with. This is the use of the term revolution and revolutions in ECHO, 18th Century Collections Online, 1700 to 1785. And I think and these are kind of word clouds generated by Philologic. And what one sees, of course, is these are co-occurrences. So the terms that are bigger and blacker are the most frequently found co-occurring with the term revolution, either in the singular and the plural. And if you look on the top right-hand corner, revolutions in the plural, we find extraordinary, frequent, several, sudden, various, violent. If we look at revolution in the singular, we have, above all, late, that is to say, it's already happened. Strange, sudden, extraordinary, happy, yes, sometimes, another. So you have a kind of the idea of revolutions as events in a sequence of disorder, and they can be happy, more usually unhappy. They can be various, violent, extraordinary. They can be late, that is to say, they have happened. Revolution is, in this database, almost always an ex post facto category. Revolutions are events that have happened. This is the Artful database, which essentially shows the same kind of result. Revolutions can be grand and general and happy and new and sudden and strange. They can occur, they can be continual, etc. What's interesting about these 2 slides, I think, is that it suggests that revolution in the 17th and 18th century is a fact, not an act. That is to say, revolutions happen. Above all, revolutions have happened. They are not the result of a collective act. They are not the result of conscious human will. They are something that occur in the flow of time. And the flow of time is disorderly, disruptive. So there are always revolutions going on. And they just happen, and often we don't really get them into perspective until they've happened, until they are the late revolutions. What's interesting about this, then, is that there are revolutions. There are no revolutionaries. The term revolutionary does not appear in the 17th and 18th century databases, except for a scattering of appearances in which it describes an individual personality as a subject to frequent change. But the idea of a revolutionary actor is simply not present in this database, because revolution is not an action category. It's something that has happened. It's an event. It's not an act. And that's true, interestingly enough, even in terms of the American insurgents, who are not described as revolutionaries in ECHO, in the 18th century English database. That may be, in fact, understandable, but they're not described as revolutionaries either in the early American database. So there's still this overwhelming sense that revolution is something that happens, and it is, therefore, an aspect of change and disorder, it's ex post facto, it's the outcome of events rather than a logic of human action. There's no internal dynamic. Revolutions occur in time. There is no time within revolutions. They are events. They've just happened. There's no dynamic within them. And of course, you can't have a kind of dynamic of revolution inside the revolution until you have a concept of revolution as action and revolutionaries as conscious actors. So in that sense, then, what we're talking about is revolution as a fact rather than revolution as an act. So then the question is, how does one move from that traditional understanding of revolution? And let me just say, parenthetically, the idea of revolution as fundamentally being a return to an initial state of things along the model of the stars and the planets, which of course is which is Hannah Arendt's big claim that this is the traditional conception of revolution. It just isn't true. Revolution in this period means any kind of change, not necessarily to a fixed place. In fact, quite often it's not to a fixed place. It's just a kind of eruption in the flow of time. So then the question is, how can we get from the idea of revolution as a fact to the modern conception of revolution as an act, so that we can have the kind of situation which I think is true now, that when you say, this is a revolution, or I am a revolutionary, there is a script, a historically developed script that has developed over the last couple of hundred years, which opens up a set of possibilities to be enacted or improvised on, but essentially are opening up possibilities for action. So what I'm showing you now then is based on a digitization of the Archives Parlementaires, that is to say, the record of the parliamentary, the debates of the national assemblies of the revolutionary period. There's a lot I could say about the defects of this data set as a data set, but let's just postulate that all data sets have radical problems about completeness and veracity, which we might want to talk about. This is certainly no different, but one of the things I think about digital humanities, which is terribly important, is that one starts with what one has. And one has to be experimental, and one has to be conscious of the difficulties, the problems with the material we're dealing with. But nonetheless, it's interesting and exciting to try and see what one can find out. So this then is the digitization of the debates of the National Assembly in France. And this first digitization is 1789. So what do we see here? Actual, that is to say, ongoing, right? Great, grand, happy, present. And then, interestingly, contre. Contre appears, counter-revolutionary appears immediately in 1789 with revolution in a new sense. You can't have a counter-revolution if a revolution is just an event that's already happened. You can only have a counter-revolution if you have revolutionaries, if you have counter-revolutionaries. So one of the interesting aspects of this very first screen is precisely the way in which revolution, counter-revolution are developing together. This is This is 1790, and you can see the same kind of development here. Actual, present is coming. Grand, big, and happy are still present. Our not revolution, our present revolution, is there, but contre is getting bigger and bigger in this slide. And then we'll go to, this is 1791 to 1793, and it's Contre versus Notre, and glorious, grand, heureuse are getting smaller as the revolution becomes more problematic as an ongoing process. And then we get to this slide, which is the word cloud for revolutionary, revolutionarily, from 1790 to 1793. And these are all of the things that go along with revolutionary, counter-revolutionaries. Revolutionary tribunal, revolutionary army, revolutionary committees, revolutionary measures, revolutionary movements. So here you have revolution being revolutionized in a very kind of significant way, in a way that we recognize in the way we now think about revolutions. And this is the Dictionary of the Académie Française in 1798. A supplement was published to include the new words that had appeared in the course of the revolution, and of course you see revolutionary as one of those new words that has occurred. And revolutionary is something which is in conformity with the principles of the revolution, something that accelerates the progress of the revolution. And eventually revolutionize, not being transformed, but put into a revolutionary state. So you can see then the way in which this kind of action category has kind of exploded in 1789, and the way in which within this action category there's a kind of script which develops and which subsequent political actors who want to call themselves revolutionaries appeal to, improvise upon, repudiate, modify, and what we have tried to do in this book, Scripting the French Revolution, is to see a succession of ways in which revolutionaries have played with the revolutionary script. One other thing I'm going to show you is there's a lot to be said about how you explain that transition from revolution as fact to revolution as act. There's a lot to be said about the Enlightenment and the way in which the Enlightenment is transforming the sense of revolution, making it a longer-term process, making it a more beneficent process, making it a process of enlightenment. All of this flows into this redefinition of the term during the revolutionary period. But there's also one text, one specific text that I point to in the article I wrote on this, which is a text written by, under the name of the Abbé Raynal, a lesser philosophe, and it was a philosophical and political history of the two Indies, that is to say, the East and West Indies, the effect of the discovery of the New World upon Europe and its, the expansion of commerce, the way in which this has transformed European society. This work went through several editions, and we have just now managed to digitize all three editions. They're quite different. And there's a spin-off, which is a spin-off from the history, philosophical and political history, which is called The Revolution in America. And this work appears in 1781. It's published in many languages. It goes through many editions, and it is an account of the American Revolution. And what's fascinating about it is that it is an account of that revolution as it is ongoing. And Raynal, in this account, he talks about debates in the House of Commons. He talks about the way in which the American insurgents communicate one with another. You are, for the first time, I think, in this work, seeing revolution enacted. And I think this is a very important element in the development of the notion of revolution as an action category. That's really the first kind of digital humanities project that I've done. As I said, it started with Artful in the University of Chicago, and I've continued to work with that database. The second one is one that I am involved in now with some colleagues, and it is, let me just find my text here. It's a project on writing rights, and what it is essentially is a study of the writing of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. The Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, of course, being a monument of human history at this point. There are many arguments, historiographical reasons why it's worth arguing about this text and how it was put together, but I won't, that isn't going to be the primary focus of what I want to say today. So here we are in, this is the group of people who are doing this work on the writing rights. My colleague Dan Edelstein, who is in the French department at Stanford and also the co-editor of the book on scripting revolution. We have two colleagues from Australia in the School of Design from the University of Sydney, who we have worked closely with them on ideas for visualization. And we then also have a very close colleague, Nicole Coleman, who is a digital researcher located at CESTA, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis at Stanford. And to make the obvious point, this kind of digital humanities work cannot be done alone. No one of us has the range of skills to do the kind of work that we wanted to do. And we have worked very closely together in trying to formulate our approach. Thomas thought that you would be interested in the organization under which we have been doing this work. So here's a slide about CESTA. And as you can see, it has three main labs. It has then several projects, four main labs, and several projects under its aegis. The first thing to say about this is that this grew organically. It was not, we did not get a pot of money which said, go and start digital humanities at Stanford. It grew out of projects, and gradually one project, there was a certain amount of mimesis here, and gradually the projects kind of got related one to another under this literary lab. There, as you can see, there are several main ones. The literary lab, directed by Franco Moretti. Franco Moretti is famous for what is called distant reading, as opposed to close hermeneutical, humanistic reading. And what Moretti pioneered was a statistical analysis of the novel in a variety of ways, which has revolutionized the understanding of the novel. Then there's a spatial history lab, which was started by Richard White, and has done a great deal of analysis of spatial relations in the novels, but spatial relations, for example, the development of the post office in the United States, and things like that. And then there's our part of the world, humanities and design, with Dan Edelstein and Nicole Coleman as really the directors. And there are a number of projects under that rubric. The flagship project is one called Mapping the Republic of Letters, the goal of which has been to take all of the letters that have been digitized, to take the markup of those letters and try to create a massive database showing the exchange of letters in the early modern period. So we can now show you a map. I can't actually show it to you now, but if you go online, you can see some parts of this. Galileo's correspondence, Voltaire's correspondence, Ben Franklin's correspondence, and we've been able to, or the people who've been doing this, I haven't been very closely involved in this, have been able to do dynamic analyses of the exchange of letters and the spatial location and the change over time in both spatial location and content. So the thing then to say about SESTA, above all, is that it's grown organically. It's been driven, above all, by projects that researchers have wanted to do. It is not departmental based. It was not subject to a university mandate to collaborate. It really grew out of the interests of the people involved in collaborating across departments. And it had one great benefit, which is money. The Stanford University, as you probably know, is a renowned scientific institution. Much of its funding comes from government or other sources, and that funding comes with a kind of, what do I call it, a surcharge. The surcharge is what the university takes in addition to any project funding for funding the university. That money goes to someone called the Dean of Research, or to the Office of the Dean of Research, which is independent of departments or divisions or schools. And some of that funding is for research, and SESTA is essentially supported by that research funding. And so we're in a very fortunate position of being able to have project-based digital humanities research funded in a really quite robust way. SESTA also, we have just started a certificate in digital humanities, so that graduate students now, in addition to having, say, a degree in history, can have a certificate in digital humanities. That's turning out to be not only intellectually very exciting for them, but very advantageous on the job market. We have graduate fellows who are being, who have a space for carrying out digital projects. We have many undergraduate researchers who are paid researchers, but who end up getting very, very excited about the possibilities of digital research in the humanities. So overall, then, we really have a very powerful engine that is supporting digital research. All right. This is here to remind me about collaboration. So we're working with a group of people in design who are interested in visualization. We're working with Nicole Coleman, who is essentially a digital researcher. And the exchange then is between the academic, the two historians in the project, and the people who are doing visual studies, and the person above all who can make this happen in terms of programming and producing a product. All of us are really getting together. And so the question, really, the bottom line here is, how do you think about visualization as a project in the digital humanities? It can't just be the historians saying, okay, here are our results, show it, find a way of visualizing it. What we found is that in the exchange, it's like the historians are saying, well, we'd love to see whether we could answer such and such a question. Is there a way in which we could visualize the way in which we want to think about the various relations, things related to these questions? And then conversely, of course, in the course of the visualization, the visual researchers will say, well, you know, why are you thinking about that way? If we're visualizing, shouldn't we visualize something else? And so the gambit overall is that through this kind of exchange, collaborative exchange, we can come up with something that will not only answer some of the very traditional questions that historians want to answer, but also come up with new notions, new questions, new ideas. So we're talking then about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Here it is in the form of mosaic tablets, the French Revolutionary equivalent of the Ten Commandments. And it very quickly, it was written in August 1789, it very quickly became canonical. It became the first book of the French Revolution. And so this is a challenge. Obviously, something like this, something as monumental as this, a historian wants to take apart, wants to see how it got to be the way it is, how the forms of the claims, how the very articles were put together, what was excluded, what was included, and so on. The most ambitious version of what we're trying to do is this. There were a whole series of draft declarations circulating in Paris and in Versailles in 1789. There was a set of debates in the French Revolutionary Assembly. And then there was, of course, an entire early modern intellectual tradition of thinking about rights. So ideally, what we would like to do is somehow imagine how these three flows produce what we now know of as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. We're far from doing that right now, but I will tell you what we've tried to do and why. These are the drafts that we're circulating. All I'm going to say about them is that there's so many, they're so different. Each of these in each of these bars is a draft. You can see how much they vary simply in terms of their length, and you can imagine in terms of their length that they are trying to say, some are trying to say much more than others. And part of the issue for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is how much you're going to say. That's a crucial question. Many drafts. I'm going to talk about. So we started, in order to think about the drafts and the relationship of the drafts to the final text, we started with the debates. And we're still with the debates. I have to say, it will be a long time before we really get back to the drafts. But this is where we are. How could we think about the drafts? So, as you can see, this was our first attempt to think about the debates. Here is a closer view of this, the preamble, the various articles. What we tried to do was to show the proposals that were made and what happened to them in the succession of the discussion in the debates. It's hard to say anything about this. It's close to reading the text. So we tried a different approach, and what we tried to do was to think about whether we could categorize the statements, the proposals that were being made in various ways. So here's a slide in which we tried to categorize the various interventions in the debate. And I should say that all of the examples I'm using, well, the main example I'm using is Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen, which was about religion and the role of religion in society. So we tried to come up with a categorization of the various ways in which religion was brought into the discussion. So the most traditional one, religion is the basis of empires. It is the eternal reason which looks at the order of things. Very traditional. This could have been said at any time during the old regime. Conservative, religion is a duty for men. It's also a right that individuals can exercise peacefully. Interesting here, duty and right. This becomes a big deal in the discussion of the Declaration of Rights of Man of the Citizen. Is it going to be a declaration of rights, or is it going to be a declaration of rights and duties? And this is a fundamental issue, and eventually duties get dropped. And I can say a little bit more about that as we go along. Conservative, religion is a duty. Conservative, liberal, religion being the most solid of political goods. So religion now here is not a metaphysical basis. It's just a good thing in politics to have a religion. And no one should be bothered in the practice of his religion. Liberal, tolerance. I mean, we're talking about a society in which Protestantism has only just been legalized in France. So liberal position, everyone, tolerance, we will tolerate all religion. Or libertarian. This is like, we don't want to talk about tolerance. Tolerance implies some kind of obstacle. Tolerance implies a ranking of religions in which one tolerates others. And the libertarian position, which is there is no constraint at all on the practice of religion. We can't talk about tolerance, we just talk about the right to practice our religion. So, though we tried to categorize the interventions in that way, and this is what we came up with. This is, we call this analysis annulus analysis. The way it works is, and this is for the whole, the whole database. The whole Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And the way you think about this is that you put the first intervention in the middle. The second intervention displaces the first intervention towards the periphery. The third displaces the first two. The fourth displaces the first three, so that you are gradually building out. So the interventions at the periphery are the first ones to have occurred. The intervention at the center is the one that ends up being adopted. So what's striking about this, among many things that are striking about this, is look how different these are. Look at the way in which the debate proceeds. Look at Article 12. You know, there's an awful lot of wordsmithing here. How exactly you're going to say it or how you're not going to say it. But in fact, it's pretty much liberal discussion from the very beginning. Article 10 is much more different. Articles 4 and 5, much more difference of opinion. So this, I think, in itself shows something really quite interesting about, where the hot button issues are and how the interventions arise. So that's one thing I want to show you. Now, I just want to point to a couple of things. I'm not going to lecture you on the early history of the French Revolution. I just want to say that on the 31st of July, there is a draft declaration which is adopted by a group within the National Assembly as a good draft. And that on the 19th of August, that draft declaration, the declaration of the Sixth Bureau, is accepted as a basis for discussion for the final version of the declaration. So here is the declaration of the Sixth Bureau, and you can see there are 24 articles. And what the Assembly does is to go systematically. Day one, it talks about the first articles, then it goes through, in the course of a week, on the basis of this text, it has produced a final version. But when you say on the basis of this text, that's just a manner of speaking, because what you find, if you compare the Sixth Bureau draft with the final version, is that there is essentially no relationship at all between the first 10 articles of the Declaration. They are completely replaced by other versions. And what's interesting about this is that these first 10 articles are overwhelmingly about rights and duties. And what's interesting about this is that the Assembly, the National Assembly, has already decided once on the 4th of August that it didn't want a declaration of rights and duties, it just wanted a declaration of rights. But duties will not go away. One of the, we're talking now about the week of the drafting of the final declaration, duties are constantly creeping back in the proposals and constantly being pushed out in the course of the discussion. So 10 articles disappear, and then you have these various articles. As you can see, the colors change. But what we end up with is a very different profile from the conservative Sixth Bureau draft to what we have at the end. Let me go on here. This is a blow-up of the discussion of Article 10 on religion. And this was another way in which we tried to analyze the sequence of debates. Article 10, no one can be troubled in the exercise of his religion, of his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their expression does not trouble the public order established by the law. That is the final version. So what we tried to do then was to follow the sequence of discussion from the Sixth Bureau draft. In fact, there were 3 articles about religion, right? Religion and morality must supplement the law. The maintenance of religion demands a public, an established religion, in effect. Respect for this established religion is obligatory. We lost the final word. Everyone who doesn't trouble the established religion cannot be bothered in his own exercise. So this is a very conservative formulation, right? We must have religion. We must have an established religion. It must be respected. And if you don't bother the established religion, you can do whatever. You can practice some other religion. But nonetheless, the weight is towards protecting the established religion. So what we do then, and I'm not going to try to run through this because it's a very extensive analysis, but what we try to do is to track the interventions in the top part of the slide, what people say, what they propose, and track the state of the game in the bottom part of the slide. So we start with Articles 16, 17, and 18 of the Sixth Bureau, and we see what happens to them. 16 and 17, someone has said, let's forget about those, we'll deal with 18. Then someone comes back and says, oh, yeah, but no society can exist without religion. We have to have some religion. So that goes back in, or the proposal is to bring that back in. That gets thrown out, and we get this, which is conservative religion. This is essentially the Sixth Bureau again. Now we're down to 17 and 18, which is the same. Then we have this very important intervention. No man can be bothered in the expression of his religious opinions, nor troubled in the exercise of his religious practice. And then then the discussion goes on, and I really won't bother you. We'll be up all night if we go through this in any detail. But you can see essentially what's happening as we end up with this formulation, and then we get another formulation when my computer catches up with me. What's interesting about this is that all of the discussion has been about the status of religious cult, meaning the established religion. What we have here is a very liberal first part, which is a previous proposal. No man can be bothered for his religious opinions. And then, provided their expression doesn't trouble the public order. The reference to a culte publique, to established religion, has disappeared. Gobert, one of the bishops, eventually becomes a bishop under the revolutionary regime, has made a crucial intervention because he said, let's take out any reference to the established religion. That will cause trouble. We will just talk about any expression which troubles public order. Then, of course, the question is public order. What's public order? How are you going to decide who's going to get prosecuted for breaching public order? I mean, that could mean anything. Anybody can claim. I can claim that you are bothering with my religious practices by exercising yours. We can have a scuffle that has produced disruption of public order. Okay, so you have to add one more phrase, which is, you must not trouble public order established by the law. And you get, therefore, a very important development, which is the way in which, consistently in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the appeal to the law as governing the expression of rights, the practice of rights, comes into play. So there we have that. So that was one way then of thinking about the debates, trying to categorize the political tone, trying to see in the case of this one article how it played out. And the crucial thing is less is more. The process of the writing of this particular article, Article 10, is you have to constantly take out what will cause problems, what will cause disagreement. And you have to remember that the National Assembly is divided, has representatives of the clergy, the nobility, the Third Estate. They have been ordered eventually by the king to occupy the same assembly, make common deliberations, but there are profound differences among them. And this is a body of 1,000, 1,100 people. This is a huge assembly. How are you possibly going to get anything agreed upon? And the answer is by saying as little as possible. And the odd thing about this then is the less that is said, the more universal the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen becomes. Because any kind of appeal to a big metaphysical assumption, or any appeal to a very particular state of things, as in an established cult, produces trouble. So you throw out the metaphysics and the philosophy. You don't talk about the state of nature. You don't talk about the social compact. You don't talk about why the basis of rights Where do they come from? You just declare rights in as concise and, what do I want to say, unclothed a way as possible. So oddly enough then, you're just stripping out anything as much as you can in order to secure agreement, which is why this document becomes, in a sense, so universal in its principles. All right, so that's the analysis of the content insofar as we've got. Now let's think about it another way, which is to say, all right, let's try to catch the dynamic of the discussion, how people intervene, the succession of interventions. How does the debate go on? So we came up then with a set of ideas like this. You have you have the articles that are adopted. You can categorize interventions as someone proposes the successful article. Someone who amends a previous proposal in a way that produces the final article. Someone who combines two proposals, bundles them together to produce the final article. Someone who speaks in favor of it. Someone who speaks in favor of it negatively by repudiating a rejection. So you have adopted, then you have a series of interventions that are close, but which are what we call wordsmithing. They don't change the substance of the article. They just, it's kind of more aesthetic than anything else. And then we have rejected, proposals that are put into play, go nowhere, proposer, amender, bundler, supporter, opposes the winner. Okay, that produces another set of rings. Same principle. You start from the middle out, and again, just look how different these are. Again, look at Article 12, that huge blue mess in the middle. Article 10, which we've just gone through. Lots of different moves. People are making very different kinds of moves in discussing these articles. That opens up a whole set of interesting questions about, why. And who. So this is an effort to combine the two sets of rings. So on the left-hand side, the content, and on the right-hand side, the nature of the intervention, and on the extreme right, the names of the people who make the intervention. So we're beginning to get a sense of the dynamic that is going into the production, in this case of Article 10. This is just a same version with a few notable points recommended. So then, let me go back here. So then the thought was, okay, let's try to give points. Let's say that we'll give a proposer, someone who proposes the final article, the ultimately successful article, 20 points, an amender, 10 points. So what we're doing is trying to get a sense of the energy that each participant might produce in the discussion. And that gives us our list of people, the Sixth Bureau, of course, because it has the original set of proposals. And then you go on with the list of people who have been important in making Article 10 happen. The Count of Mirabeau being important here, number 33, but before him, Anonyme, that's unfortunate. There's not much we can do about Anonymous. But then Mounier, Duport, Target, Laborde, a group of very moderate revolutionaries, and then the Count of Mirabeau. So, what we're seeing is that in this case, it's the moderates who do most of the work. And this is here are the proposers of the and amenders and bundlers of the articles that are adopted, those that are failed, and here we have the successful proposers and amenders, showing them by social status. So we can get a sense then of who intervenes in this debate and what kind of people they are. Are they nobility, clergy, third estate, and indeed, what are the individuals? Who are the individuals who are doing this? One of the questions that came up this afternoon in the workshop that was particularly interesting was, if you were going to apply this analysis to all of the other articles, would you find someone, let's say Mirabeau for an example, would you find them consistently having a political, being coded the same color in terms of their political opinions consistently, or would you find, in fact, that there's no consistency in their positions and that everything they do is kind of situational? That would be particularly interesting for Mirabeau. And I should say, Mirabeau, this list is a list made up of people depending on who they represented. Mirabeau, of course, was a noble, but he was elected to represent the third estate, not the nobility. So in this case, we put him in that category. So that's it, folks. I mean, that's essentially where we are. We think we've been able to catch some elements of the dynamic of the discussion of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. We think, above all, we've been able to understand the process, or at least see the process, much more clearly than we could before, of the way in which this declaration is constantly being pared down. One could imagine doing that without visualization, but it would be an awful lot to keep in one's head. And these are really, I think, quite remarkable ways of showing, of catching a situation and showing what's going on with it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be grateful for your questions.
Thank you.